I have returned! God, that was bad. Hello everybody, it is me, Sci-Fi, and today we are coming back to the Can Limbo Save It series today. You thought I forgot, didn't you? Yeah, I know, it's been 2 months. Well anyway, today's episode we are going to be finally moving into pistols, and for today I decided to choose a pretty obscure weapon, one that very few content creators talk about, and that is the Euphona Prime. Now, the Euphona Prime is different this time. You see, it isn't the case of a particularly bad weapon that we're making good, but much rather a weapon that was considered somewhat good that we're going to see if it can stack up with other weapons that exist currently in today's meta. The Euphona Prime is interesting from the start because there is no normal version of this weapon. There is only the Euphona Prime, making it quite unique in comparison to other weapons that exist today. And in addition, it has 2 firing modes. The first firing mode is a high damage slug, and the secondary fire is a widespread buckshot. And both firing modes have completely different stats from one another in order to compensate for these differences. For example, the buckshot has high status but very low crit, whereas the slug has high crit but low status. In addition, the slug has mostly impact damage in its damage weighting, whereas the buckshot has mostly slash in its damage weighting. However, despite this thing being very popular enough from my understanding to be used at Eidolon hunts, it has unfortunately fallen off a lot over the years, with weapons like the Latum in particular overshadowing it. But today we're going to see if we can revitalize it in some way. Now before we move on to the build that I have for this weapon, we must first talk about the biggest problems that this weapon has. For starters, the low status on the slug. Now because the damage is extremely high on the slug, this isn't too big of an issue if we don't have enough statuses, like we can just get them from an outside source, but because we can't proc things such as internal bleeding or any other status that's a DOT, it means that we can't rely on DOTs to deal most of our damage, and rather have to rely entirely on the slug. Now you might be looking at the buckshot and thinking, why don't we just get our DOTs there, because it's mostly slash and it has relatively good status. Well, because the damage is spread across all the pellets in our calculations, it means that the slash ticks are very, very small, to put it lightly. And rather, I suggest using this as a priming tool, in terms of the alt fire, that is. And then using the priming from the secondary fire to strengthen the primary fire. This allows us to get lots of damage out of the slug while utilizing the buckshot in some way that isn't primarily for damage. And in concept, this is very cool for a weapon like the Euphona Prime, having a primer and a primary fire that does most of the damage, since we have it in the form of the Cedo. But the issue with Euphona Prime is that because it is mostly a single target weapon, it's less useful as your primary source of damage and more so as an extra flavor to your attacks. Like, say, using it on Eximus units or certain bosses, rather than using it on all the enemies around you. And it also doesn't help that the magazine capacity is very small, and our maximum ammo is really bad as well. Now, as you can see on my Euphona Prime, I am modding for corrosive and radiation. Now, you might be wondering, why am I not going for viral? Well, that's because we can use outside sources if we want to get viral, such as through a Sentinel or through a Panzer, etc. And I feel using corrosive is more important here because if we can strip enough of the armor to boost our damage, we can also keep the bonus damage that can pass through armor, which is also why I'm modding for radiation. Because radiation has a 75% extra damage multiplier through armor against enemies like the Grineer. That, and I've kind of just gotten bored of modding for viral, so I wanted to try something different. Also, on our Sentinel, we are modding for, well, radiation and corrosive as well, but we are also modding for cold. And now you might be wondering, why cold? Well, if you remember from one of my older videos on Vile Rush, I talked about how cold procs can not only add slow through overguard, but can also add extra crit damage for our weapons. And since the Euphona Prime, especially on headshots, is getting increased crit chance and increased crit damage, it felt only necessary to use cold in this situation. Here we're also using the newly added Shivering Contagion in order to spread the cold procs even more. Here's also a look at my Baz move setup so you can see what I am using on it in case you're interested, because I think that's also a very underrated weapon. And lastly, here is a look at my newly reworked Limbusi setup, because after the addition of Energy Nexus, I went a little ham and changed some things around to make it more interesting. So here's a look at it against general enemies.
Additional life support has arrived.
Here's a look at it against Eximus units. And then here is Euphona Prime against an Acolyte. Now, if you want to take this even further, I would recommend figuring out a spot to put in Galvanized Shot, because the extra damage on status effect can be pretty nutty under the right conditions. And overall, that's kind of it. The Euphona Prime is still a half-decent pistol, I would say, but with the mix of the low magazine and maximum ammo capacity, and just the general fact that it's kind of obtuse to use, I would only go for this if you really enjoy using this weapon like I do, and otherwise there are better options, but it's still a relatively decent weapon. Well, anyway, that's been me, Sci-Fi. I hope this video helped you out in deciding whether or not you should use this weapon or not. And if you guys got any tips and tricks that I should know about when it comes to this weapon that I may not have found while doing research, I would highly recommend that you comment down below and let me know. And I'll make sure to pin them if they are very important. And with that, have a wonderful day, everybody.